there are so many places where we could start. There's the Epstein Files. There's the Oval Office meeting with MBS. Where would you like to start?
Let's start with what you said, which I think was very significant, and that is this is the most corrupt administration in the history of the United States. You have a president whose family is doing a multi-million-dollar business with the Saudis, who is benefiting in every way from what is happening. And let me point out, so people understand this, it's called Saudi Arabia because the Saudi family rules the Arabian Peninsula. If tomorrow the Saudi family were overthrown, the name of the peninsula might be the Islamic Republic of Arabia. And, you know, it's a curious thing because the corruption that we are seeing now extends to what Donald Trump is doing as president of the United States. And let me tell you, the White House is for sale. It's very clear.
Does it matter if there are no consequences? In other words, is it really stealing if I do it out in the open and I don't go to prison for it and I can't even be arrested for it? Is it stealing anymore?
It's not a question of stealing. It's a matter of pure corruption. This is a president who is allowing the Saudis to have undue influence. The Saudis, a family, to have undue influence. It's a merger between two corrupt families, the Trump family and the Saudi family. And every American president has dealt with the Saudi family because we understand that we would rather have a corrupt Saudi family on the throne of the Arabian Peninsula than a radical Islamic regime. And there's no question that every president has dealt with the Saudis, but nothing like what we have seen today. And that is what is so upsetting. And by the way, the murder of Khashoggi wasn't just a murder. They dismembered his body.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you saw it, but Khashoggi's widow appeared on CNN and spoke about all of these implications with eloquence and power. And one wonders where in the world the congressional Republicans are. There should be an investigation. Believe me, if this were a Democrat doing what Donald Trump is doing, there would be a congressional investigation to end all congressional investigations, and corruption would be understood clearly for what it is.
But that's my point. Since we know that there is going to be no investigation, since we know that there's not going to be any Republican pushback, if I am the Trump administration, why not be corrupt to my heart's content? Why not do all this out in the open? Why not cut these side deals with the Saudi royal family? Because there's an old African-American saying, who gonna check me, boo? Which basically means who is going to stop me? If I'm Donald Trump and there's no one opposing me, why not accept a Qatari jet?
Why do you think the Republicans are in such a panic over redistricting, which they may not get because of court action? Because they know that a year from now, a year from January 1st, there will be very probably Democrats in control of the Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And that will mean investigations. And that's why Donald Trump is desperate to ensure Republican control. And when you get to the Epstein matter, it's very clear. Speaker Johnson is very unhappy. The Republicans repudiated their leadership. Johnson had to go along with it, even though he was instructed by Trump to do everything he could to obstruct it. And now, as you know, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of the United States, has, at the president's behest, instigated an investigation of Democrats. Now, let me explain to you, and you've explained it, I think, already, but let me do it again, that once an investigation begins, you can, in fact, halt any revelations. And that's why we're waiting, and I know Kim is monitoring carefully what Donald Trump is doing now that he's back at the White House.
Let's take this further. Let's assume that that is the card that the Trump administration will play. They'll open these investigations into Larry Summers and Bill Clinton specifically, which would halt the release of any Epstein documents. What is then the response, or I would say the card that the Democrats can play other than gnash their teeth?
The Democrats have no cards. What they have is an upcoming election. And if we learned anything from the election 2 weeks ago, is that the Democrats can win. And I think the corruption is so evident, so clearly understandable. If I were head of the Democratic National Committee, that's what I'd be talking about. Pure corruption. And that would mean investigations into everything, including, frankly, the Trump Organization. They're planning to build a Trump Tower in Jeddah.
Yes.
You understand, in Saudi Arabia itself. This is unprecedented in terms of corruption. It's a long way from the Eisenhower administration, when Sherman Adams, the chief of staff to the president, had to resign for accepting a vicuna coat. I mean, this is beyond comprehension. And we're talking millions and millions and millions of dollars flowing into the Trump family coffers. So,
John,
yeah,
I agree with you. I think you're right. And I think it's going to come down to the midterms. But let's say the Democrats do retake the House and do start these congressional hearings and investigations and do even start impeachment proceedings. My question would be, to what end? Because we've seen 2 previous impeachments which did not lead to Senate conviction and removal, and I suspect it would be the same this time around. In other words, what would be the end game beyond embarrassing and exposing what this administration has been doing?
That's what it is, embarrassing and exposing. Because in order to remove a president, you need 2/3 of the United States Senate and articles of impeachment. It is clear to me that the Republicans will not have 2/3 of the Senate, and therefore we're not talking about impeachment here. What we are talking about is what we saw this last week. Do you understand? The Republican Party, its president, its Speaker of the House, did not want to bring up the Epstein matter, and they were compelled by public opinion, and they lost overwhelmingly. Only one representative in the House voted against this, a Republican. And so I can only tell you, I have faith that in the end, the truth will come out. How much damage will be done? How much money will the Trump family make in the meantime? How much money have they already made? I can't account for that, but I can say that the Democrats have an obligation to explain to the American people what this corruption is, and the American people, I believe, will then rise up and repudiate it. At least I hope so.
What do you think?
Otherwise, I may go into politics. And would you like me my partner in a major corruption deal, knowing it will never be investigated?
Right. What then should Minority Leader Jeffries and Minority Leader Schumer be doing, other than just going to the rostrum and talking about corruption? What would you want them to be doing?
That's
right
all
now?
they can do. Don't you understand? If you don't control the levers of power, if you don't have a majority in the Senate or a majority in the House, there's nothing you can do. And the presumption is that in a midterm election, the party out of power does better. Right. That's what the Republicans are scared of. Look what's happening now, where the courts are saying this redistricting doesn't work. Do you know that even here in California, if I can make it very local,
sure,
the Republican Party and the Justice Department are trying to go to court in order to have Prop 50 thrown out. Mm-hmm. It'll never happen because the will of the people was shown dramatically. Over 60% of the people of California voted for Prop 50. But they are going to pull out every stop in order to make this. Now, the next question is, what will be revealed from the Epstein Files? And that's another great question. We had an announcement this morning by a leading Republican that if, in fact, this material is not let out, he will go to the floor of the Congress and will speak the names so that everyone knows what we're talking about. And you mentioned Ghislaine Maxwell earlier, and Kim did a great job reporting that. Can you imagine this corruption? And do you know the president will not rule out a pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell?
Nope,
it is the most, I had an argument with someone yesterday. We were talking presidential history, and I made the statement, which I believe to be true, that this is the most corrupt administration in the history of the country. And there will be books written about it. And history will judge this administration and this Congress harshly.
You're right. They will. But I think people are more impatient and want to see some sort of karma, justice, comeuppance, response in the here and now.
There aren't the votes. You may want something here and now. Let me tell you, I'd like to win the lottery if I ever bought a ticket. I'd like to do it right now. And then I'd bail out the Mark Thompson program, give them all the money they need. But it isn't going to happen. So I'm very practical from a political point of view. The developments this week were so stunning, so powerful, that if I had suggested to you a week ago that the House would do what it did, and the Senate would then follow, and the president would be put on the spot, you wouldn't want me on this program. You would have said, John, you're nuts. I'm not nuts. I know exactly.
What do you think the president's calculation is at this point? Not that we know what he's thinking or what he would even say, but what do you think his concerns or considerations, given that he can't necessarily indefinitely withhold the Epstein files?
We don't know. That's a great speculative question. But if the president had a choice between releasing the files or not, clearly he doesn't want to. He will be, now there may be no criminal action on his part, but it will be embarrassing. When I heard him just the other day say that he wanted the investigation of the Democrats because the Democrats are the one who were in collusion with Jeffrey Epstein. Nonsense. You know it and I know it.
Yeah.
But there's more than that. To call this a Democrat hoax, by the way, every time a Republican uses the term Democrat, I'm infuriated because it's the Democratic Party. Look, that's how they're incorporated. And when Republican leaders take up that line, it irritates me. It would be like calling the Republican Party the Republic Party. You know, it's just absolutely nonsense. But all these things, ultimately, I have to have faith in the American people. I had a big argument with Mark about this because Mark says, nah, you're putting your faith in the people. If I don't put my faith in the people, we're in deep trouble. Look what's happening right now in Charlotte, North Carolina. Look at the roundups that are taking place, that are now being extended to other cities in North Carolina. I used a statement on my podcast, Around the Political World with John Rothmann. That was my blatant plug. I used the expression Gestapo tactics in the streets of America. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Can you imagine, ladies and gentlemen, having to carry your passport with you and then having no guarantee that someone's stopping you would stop them? Do you know that here in California, we've done a very brave thing. We've said, you bring ICE officials in here, you bring border police in here, their faces have to be unmasked. Because do you understand that the argument being made by the Trump administration is, let them mask their faces. They're being threatened. Well, all I can say is you go into that kind of business, you better be willing to have public exposure. So there's a lot at stake here in terms, not just of Epstein, not just in terms of Saudi Arabia, not just in terms of what's happening in North Carolina, but in terms of American democracy, the very system that we must fight to preserve because your freedom and my freedom depend on the strength of America and its democratic institutions.
Where do you think we're headed in regard to Venezuela? Yes, there probably will be more extrajudicial killings of people on fishing boats. That's going to continue. But is it going to escalate from where you sit to some sort of military intervention where we could find ourselves in some sort of quasi-conflict with the country of Venezuela?
It won't be a quasi-conflict. It'll be a conflict. The president has already authorized actions by the CIA on the ground in Venezuela. Now, I was asked a legitimate question. Is there a way for Congress to intervene? And you may recall the War Powers Act passed as a result of the Vietnam War. Tom Eagleton, former senator from Missouri, who was for 18 days the running mate of George McGovern for vice president, wanted a resolution submitted, a law submitted, called the War Powers Act. Now, I interviewed Tom Eagleton about this because in the end, he voted against the War Powers Act. Why? Because what the War Powers Act, in fact, did was to expand the powers of a president in terms of making war. There is no check on a president's ability to move the military. He is the commander in chief. And I can only tell you that one of the lessons we should have learned is not that we need to limit the powers of the president. We have to be aware of who his president of the United States is. Dwight Eisenhower once said, and he was a general on top of everything else, five-star general, commander of our forces in Europe during World War II. When he was president, he said, I may have the power, but I'd never exercise it without the Congress supporting me. And he was absolutely right. But that was just a statement, not a reality. So the odds are, because the Gerald R. Ford is there with supporting operations, that we may well become entangled in a conflict. This is not the first time, by the way, a president has acted unilaterally when it comes to South America. Remember Lyndon Johnson sending troops into the Dominican Republic back in 1965. I point this out because the Congress, if it is potent, has to be consulted. But do you understand, Donald Trump feels no need to consult this Congress. We have a Speaker of the House of Representatives who is criticizing the Senate for passing the legislation relative to the files, the Epstein files, because they didn't do due diligence. They didn't correct what flaws were in the House bill. This is nothing less than astounding. And may I say, I'm a student of the House of Representatives. One of the best books on the House of Representatives was written by the late Dick Cheney and his wife, Lynn Cheney, Kings of the Hill. You want to understand the dynamic of how the House should work, whether you like Dick Cheney or not, his book demonstrates how the power of the House of Representatives, the people's house, should be exercised. This Speaker of the House, Speaker Johnson, and I will say this without any hesitation, is the worst Speaker of the House of Representatives in American history. Certainly a man who does not uphold the honor of the House. And that, to me, also needs to be addressed. And in the end, the Republicans will be held accountable. If I were running the campaign for the Democrats in this race for the House of Representatives coming up, I would emphasize the fact of the complete abdication of congressional power, which is a violation of the very essence of the American system's idea of balance of power. And speaking of balance of power, we haven't talked yet about the Supreme Court. We'll be talking about that in the days ahead regularly. Why? Because the Supreme Court is going to make a ruling on whether or not the president's imposition of tariffs is constitutional. And I'm going to tell you right now, if that court acts in an impartial fashion, these tariffs will be ruled unconstitutional. To have tariffs, they have to be voted on by the Congress of the United States. Just study the history of the Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930 and understand that Smoot-Hawley survived until it was repealed by the Congress. The fact that this president is imposing tariffs unilaterally and based, by the way, on personal preferences, whether he likes or dislikes a particular leader, is a complete abuse of presidential power. He may
John,
have
you're right.
the power, but it's an abuse. So
You're
I'm
right.
hoping, yeah, I know. I'm hoping. Will you tell my wife I'm right, for God's sake? What I'm hoping is that the Supreme Court will stand up and just say no. Now, there are two members of the court, Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas, who will vote lockstep with whatever this president wants. But we have at least three liberals on the court who will not. And the two people I am watching carefully are Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett. If they dissent, this president could lose on the tariffs question by a 5-4 vote. And I hope, I pray for the American system that that is precisely what happens.
John, when I say you're right, I agree with you, but I don't agree with you that Congress is going to grow a spine, that they're going to do anything less than further abdicate their responsibility as a co-equal branch here. And they've had every opportunity until this point. And let's not also forget, if the Democrats should take the House in the midterms, it doesn't mean that we're past MAGA and this moment where norms will begin to matter, where subpoenas will begin to matter.
You're correct. But look what happened in the last 24 hours, where there was a rebellion against Donald Trump. Now, it was a rebellion which in the end happened because he gave consent to it. But if he hadn't given consent, he would have gone to a massive defeat, gone down to a massive defeat. And I believe that that's the key. The American people have to stand up and be countered. And that's why these midterm elections in less than a year are going to be so critical for all of us. In the meantime, we have to count on the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court acts properly, there will be a check on presidential power. By the way, there's another facet here, because Donald Trump will be president for another 3 years, roughly. And what kind of check is there on a president who believes he's a king? And that's a big issue. It goes to the heart of presidential power, and that's something that needs to be discussed and debated throughout this country.
What can you glean from the actions, the rhetoric, and the 180 of Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene? I'm not saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
I'm sorry. You said Marjorie Traitor Greene? Let's remember what Donald Trump calls her. Let me tell you, this is a woman who talked about Jewish space lasers.
Yes.
Let me tell you, I'm a nice Jewish boy. Space lasers? Are they nuts? She's a nut. She's a kook. And all I can tell you is that Donald Trump is now going to try to purge her. And that's a warning for every Republican. You cross this president, he'll purge you. He just made the threat against the Speaker of the House in Indiana, who is dissing the idea of the redistricting in Indiana. And the president is pointing out, I can primary you and anybody else who opposes me. That, my friends, is absolutely disgusting.
What do you think her play is, though? What do you think she's trying to get? Is she trying to position herself for post MAGA, or is she up to something else?
No, of course she is. She wants to survive. She's smart enough to see this, but I give her credit. I'm not a fan of Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'd never vote for her. I don't like her. But she's clearly, by the way, I think, an anti-Semite, among other things. But let me be clear. She can see the handwriting on the wall. And she herself was a victim of sexual abuse. You know, it's one thing when you deal with something theoretically. It's another thing when you deal with something that really happened to you. I will tell you, and I'm not ashamed of this at all, listening to the women who were abused by Jeffrey Epstein, I wept. I tell you, I ran a program in Southern California for 14-year-olds, boys and girls. And I had one hard, fast rule with my staff. Nobody lays a hand on a kid. One staff member, I won't say he laid a hand on, but he was flirting. Took him out and I fired him immediately. A 14-year-old is not an adult. And a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old, these are still children in many, many ways. They may not look like children, but they are. And the idea that these women, more than 1,000 of them, we are told, were abused by Jeffrey Epstein. And I'm going to say something. I know there were some people who will be very angry at me for saying this. Donald Trump knew. You know how I know he knew? Because he talked about the fact that Jeffrey Epstein liked young girls. That's enough for me to understand that he maintained a friendship. You know, by the way, why he threw Jeffrey Epstein out of the Mar-a-Lago program? Not over women, not over girls, but over a real estate deal.
Yep.
And, you know, these things are so clear, so self-evident. And this president is so corrupt on so many levels. Now, I have to tell you, I had a discussion with a good friend of mine who said, but look at all the good he's done. And he enumerated certain things that were good. And remember, I worked for Richard Nixon. I saw Richard Nixon declare war on cancer. I saw him create the Environmental Protection Agency. I saw him open the door to China, détente with Russia. I saw many of the good things that Richard Nixon did. But you can take all of the good things and put them on a scale. But when you do something so egregious, so corrupt, which is what Dick Nixon did, and I worked for Dick Nixon. Let me tell you, I'm proudly associated with many of the things that Nixon did. I wasn't proud about that. I was one of the first to call for his removal from office. I feel that Republicans, like Liz Cheney and Kinzinger and others, who have stood up, look what's happened to them. And I think this revenge and retribution, this is another point. And I know we're running out of time. You know, I don't like time limits, so I just want you to know that.
No harm done.
I had a long argument with a very close friend of mine over this before the election. He said to me, well, you know, he doesn't really mean retribution. He doesn't really mean it. And now we all know he meant it, and he's doing it. And by God, that's enough in my mind to disqualify him from being trusted on any matter. I hope, by the way, there's now discussion in Ukraine. Not that I want to shift topics with you as we roll forward, but look what happened last night in Ukraine. Look at the missiles that were fired. Yes. And now there is a plan that is being put forward by Trump, which favors Putin. Well, if I were Zelensky and the Ukrainians, I'd say I'm sorry, you got to be careful. I would say absolutely not. This is a matter, and I've said it before and I'll say it again. If there were no nuclear weapons involved, if Russia weren't rattling the nuclear saber, there is no doubt in my mind that there would have been a ground war in Europe to liberate Ukraine. The Europeans are united in their fear of Putin and imperial Russia. And that's what we're talking about, the restoration of a Russian empire. So I must tell you, this is the other thing. Donald Trump just rolls over for Vladimir Putin. Look, he stood on a stage and said he trusted Russian intelligence more than American intelligence, his own intelligence people. What more do you need to have to know there's something rotten in the White House?
Well, we don't need any more, but MAGA clearly is impervious to these facts.
Yes, but they're not the majority. And that is the point. We will have an election in which these facts can be laid out and in which the American people, the overwhelming majority, will, in my opinion, reject what Donald Trump is doing. Now, of course, the next question is who succeeds Donald Trump? Somebody asked me, well, why can't we get rid of him? And the answer is you get J.D. Vance. And according to Trump, the two leading candidates to succeed Trump will be J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. That's not a very compelling choice. And the Democrats have a problem themselves. You know, the sooner these midterms are over and the Democrats begin the battle for leadership of the Democratic Party, please notice I said the Democratic Party, the better off we are. Do you understand? You cannot attack a leader without having a real, genuine spokesperson who can stand up and respond. That's the purpose behind a Democratic nominee for president. So I'm going to tell you, and I'm looking forward to being on the program with you whenever Mark is out, when we can talk about what the Democratic Party should do. This is democracy at the crossroads. And let's hope that everyone rises to the challenge.
He is presidential historian and host of the Around the Political World podcast. Sean Rothman, I enjoyed my conversations with you. I mean, I agree with most of the things you're saying, but I'm not so sure that I agree with the amount of hope that you have going forward. Hopefully you can, I'll be proved wrong, but I'm cynical on this one.
If I don't have hope, why, I lose what little hair I still have left. And of course, I would be in complete despair if you believe, as I believe, that ultimately the American experiment survives and thrives. This too will pass. May I say, sir, a high honor. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to support the Mark Thompson program, make a contribution, support it, and wish Mark all the best. I hope he survives this latest natural catastrophe.
John Rothman, you are more special than words can say. We thank you for everything you do for the show.
Thank you so much.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.